is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Luigi Barkil. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories this hour. Italians vote in a historic election that could see its most right-wing government since World War II. Surrender or risk being killed. Ukraine's President Zelensky urges Russian forces to give up their fight. And Britain's main opposition, Labour Party, holds its annual conference with one eye on the UK's next general election. Italians are voting in an election to deliver the country's 8th Prime Minister in just 11 years. Giorgia Meloni looks set to become the country's first female leader, with her Brothers of Italy party heading a far-right coalition. It could see the most right-wing government take charge of Italy since the Second World War. Sunday's snap election was called after Mario Draghi's ruling coalition collapsed in July. Our correspondent Alex Fraser is in the northern city of Milan for us, but first let's head to the capital, Rome, and speak to Hermione Kitson. Hermione, the Brothers of Italy party, relatively obscure at the last election. How do you explain this surge in support?
Yes, well, interestingly, Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party received only 4% of the national vote at the last election 4 years ago. Her fast rise in popularity is being attributed to the fact that her party was the only one that refused to partake in the Draghi government's broad coalition. So those voters really seeking change are expected to vote for her. Alongside her in the right-wing coalition is the Matteo Salvini's League party and also Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia. If Giorgia Meloni is appointed as Prime Minister, she will be, as you said, the country's first female Prime Minister and the country's first far-right leader since World War II. On the other side of the spectrum, the Democratic Party leads the left-wing coalition alongside the Green and the Left parties, while also in the mix is Giuseppe Conte's Five Star movement, which has experienced a surge in support in recent weeks. I spoke with some voters across the capital this morning. Let's hear what they had to say.
We need something different.
It's not important the result, but however, going to vote is our right.
We'll see with the future. I mean, it's the people decide, so we will see what the majority has to say.
And Hermione, like many European countries, the war in Ukraine being felt in Italy, and some concern, perhaps, over what some of the right-wing parties have had to say about both Russia and Ukraine.
Well, of course, throughout the election campaign, the war in Ukraine was a huge election theme. And there is concern that a huge political shift could actually also affect Italy's stance. And while Giorgia Meloni has always said she supports Ukraine and she supports NATO, her right-wing allies have actually been criticised for their close ties with Russia. For example, Salvini is opposed to sanctions, and Silvio Berlusconi just a few days ago on national television actually defended Putin's invasion. Within this context, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she warned Italy of consequences if it veers away from democratic principles. So there is a lot at stake in terms of Italy's position in the EU and also its stance on Ukraine. So all eyes will be watching tonight what will happen in terms of a result after 11 p.m. local time.
Thanks, Hermione. That's Hermione Kitson for us live in Rome. Let's head to Alex Fraser now in Milan. Alex, we're heading for a 7th Italian Prime Minister in the past decade. Why has there been so much political instability?
Well, Italy does have a bit of a reputation for having unstable governments, and this is all because Italy has a part proportional electoral system, which means there's lots of little parties that are in the parliament, and therefore it means you need grand coalitions in order to govern. And that, in many cases, that can mean a smaller party withdrawing their support from the coalition leads to a government collapsing. When that sort of thing happens, you might think it might lead to an election, but in many circumstances, those parties then change around, create a new coalition, and continue to govern. Now, often this means there's a change of prime minister, because in Italy's political system, the president, the head of state, that's currently Sergio Mattarella, basically chooses a prime minister who he thinks will have support in both of Italy's houses of parliament to lead a government. And that can often mean it's a non-political figure, like we just saw with the technocratic Grand Coalition headed by Mario Draghi. This is often why Italy seems to have so many different prime ministers, and often without an election.
And Italy's still very much a major economy. What challenges will the next government face?
Well, it's been a really bruising electoral period because it's been really curtailed into such a short period compared to usual, with many Italians away in August. So therefore, it's kind of been like a 3-week campaign. And that's had huge divisions between left and right, and often between those, even inside those two blocks as well. The major issue here, of course, is cost of living and the energy crisis. Italy doesn't have nuclear power, so it's quite reliant on gas, even for producing electricity, which means bills are obviously going up for the average family. We touched upon there the relationship with Europe, and depending on who is victorious and which coalition will govern, that could have a major impact and a very different change to the relationship with Europe, or it could indeed stay the same. There's a lot depending on that 200 billion post-pandemic recovery fund that Italy is receiving from the EU. But the markets will also be watching, because Italian public debt is the second highest in the Eurozone. It's 150% of GDP. Now, we're going to get a better idea tonight on which sort of parties or what kind of government might inherit some of these issues when we get the exit poll after voting closes at 2100 GMT tonight.
Thank you, Alex. That's Alex Fraser for us live in Milan. Moscow has promised what it says will be full protection to areas of Ukraine that vote to break away from the country in referendums that have been widely condemned internationally. Voting's taking place in 4 eastern Ukrainian regions under the control of Russian-backed separatists. It follows an explicit warning from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev that Moscow could use all available weapons to defend the territories. Kiev has declared the referendums illegal, while Western nations have dismissed them as a sham. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the pledge to protect the areas annexed by Russia on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York.
The entire territory of the Russian Federation, which is enshrined and could be further enshrined in the Constitution of the Russian Federation, is unquestionably under the full protection of the state. That is absolutely natural, and all of the laws, doctrines, concepts and strategies of the Russian Federation apply to all of its territory.
At least 730 people are thought to have been arrested across Russia during protests against Moscow's decision to call up civilians to fight in Ukraine. Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered Russia's first military draft since World War II last week, prompting thousands to flee across borders in order to avoid conscription. Many Western governments say the move is an attempt by Moscow to reinforce a failing war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on Russian soldiers to surrender, saying those who lay down their weapons will be treated in a, quote, civilized manner. Our correspondent Sergio Olmos is in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, for us. Sergio, President Zelensky appealing directly to Russian forces. What exactly did he have to say?
Right, he's speaking directly to the Russian people who are being caught up in this conscription. Of course, President Volodymyr Zelensky speaks Russian perfectly. He has addressed Russian people before. He is saying that anybody who surrenders to Ukrainian forces, first he's saying, don't die on the battlefield for, Putin's war. He's saying that if you do surrender, that you would be treated under the international conventions of prisoners, that you would be treated humanely. And of course, the recent prisoner swap, Ukrainian officials are pointing to that, saying, that the Russian prisoners of war that were given to Russia, showing how they were not deprived of nutrition or anything like that. President Volodymyr Zelensky saying that if people who surrender don't want to be returned to Russia for fear of punishment, that they would work out some kind of arrangement where they wouldn't be part of a prisoner swap. Let's hear a little bit from President Volodymyr Zelensky himself.
The Russian Authority understands perfectly it's sending its citizens to their death. There are no other options available. Russian commanders do not care about Russian lives. They simply need to fill the empty spots left by the killed, wounded, deserting or captured Russian soldiers. Your government doesn't care who fills those spots.
And so you can hear from President Volodymyr Zelensky there, talking directly to the Russian people. We also heard from the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces saying that we've already defeated the Russian professional army. We will defeat now the Russian amateur army. So there is a kind of carrot and a stick there. You know, surrender, but if you insist on coming, that the Ukrainian forces, are ready to fight.
Sergio, these recent developments make this feel like an important time in this conflict. What's the latest on the ground?
Yeah, so let's focus in on just the south. On Ukraine says in the last 24 hours there have been airstrikes and shelling in 35 settlements. Ukraine says it has shot down 4 Russian aircraft, though we aren't able to independently verify that. Russia says that Ukraine has been shelling parts of Zaporizhia that it controls, including a fertilizer warehouse. This is according to the Russian state media, citing an unnamed source. We know that Zaporizhia has seen heavy shelling in the last 72 hours. There have been, just in the last 24 hours, 10 missile strikes in the city of Zaporizhia. This is the one under Ukrainian control, hitting residential areas. Power has been cut to the city numerous times in the last 72 hours. There are residential buildings hit, even a hotel has been destroyed. We know that Zaporizhia is also one of the regions that Russia is currently conducting its referendum, carrying out this voting there in the parts it controls. Only about 30% of people who lived in Zaporizhia prior to the invasion still live in the Russian-occupied areas. But in the Ukrainian-held areas, there is a passageway for people who are fleeing Russian-occupied areas to travel to. It is one of the points where people can enter Ukrainian lines, civilians, and it has seen shelling over the past 72 hours. So just a lot of activity occurring there. We also know that right next to it is where Ukrainian forces are pushing in the Kherson area, but citizens in Zaporizhia seeing an increased number of attacks on civilian infrastructure.
Thanks for that update, Sergio. That's our correspondent, Sergio Olmos in Kiev. Germany has secured a deal to buy liquefied natural gas from the United Arab Emirates as Europe's largest economy tries to diversify its energy supplies. Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been meeting officials in the capital, Abu Dhabi, as part of a 2-day trip to the Gulf region. On Saturday, he met Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Jeddah and finishes his trip in Qatar. Democratic People's Republic of Korea has fired a ballistic missile off its eastern coast. It comes ahead of planned military drills by South Korean and U.S. forces and a visit by U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris to Seoul this week. The 4-day exercises start on Monday and will be the biggest joint drills since 2017. Kenya's Eliud Kipchoge has smashed his own world record at the Berlin Marathon. He ran at a time of 2 hours, 1 minute and 9 seconds, knocking half a minute off his previous best, which he set at the same event 4 years ago. In 2019, he ran a marathon distance in under 2 hours, but it wasn't registered as a record as it wasn't an official race. Still ahead here on The World Today. French wine producers look for solutions beyond their shores as scorching temperatures destroy a treasured harvest.
This week on Razor, the problem with renewable energy is storing it. For that, you need batteries. This week, we look at all manner of battery technologies and how we must be sure we're not replacing one form of pollution with another.
We don't want recycling to restrict and hamper innovation on batteries. By the same token, we need batteries that are designed for recycling and remanufacture.
a reminder of our headlines. A historic election in Italy that could see its most right-wing government since World War II. And surrender or risk being killed. Ukraine's President Zelensky urges Russian forces to give up their fight. Britain's main opposition Labour Party has slammed the government's so-called mini-budget, which was unveiled on Friday. It focuses heavily on cutting taxation, something Finance Minister Kwasi Kwarteng says will stimulate the economy by encouraging spending. Many economists, though, aren't convinced, with some critics calling the plans reckless. Our correspondent Kimberly Lim reports.
It's busy at this food bank in the town of Warrington. Omar is just one of the many people here increasingly reliant on the charity. The cost of living crisis biting hard.
Midnight, my paycheck went in. Before the sun come up, I'm broke again. Because by the time you take care of just keeping the lights on, rent and everything else, there's nothing left.
Is your plan a gamble? The pressure is on for the country's new finance minister, Kwasi Kwarteng, to deliver help, and quickly, for the millions of Britons struggling to make ends meet. The emergency budget includes tax cuts aimed at boosting consumer spending, but it's seen as a high-risk strategy and has sparked concerns that increased public borrowing will worsen the cost of living crisis. The pound slumped on reaction to the announcement, hitting a 37-year low against the dollar. Despite the worrying market reaction, Mr Kwarteng says his measures will drive long-term growth.
As Chancellor of the Exchequer, I don't comment on market movements. What I am focused on is growing the economy and making sure that Britain is an attractive place to invest, and so that it's a competitive global arena. And we have to show that this country is open for business and that we're driving growth.
But not everyone agrees. Some say the measures will not help the people that need it the most, with tax cuts only set to benefit high-income earners. A sentiment echoed by the opposition leader, Sir Keir Starmer.
I do not think that the choice to have tax cuts for those that are earning hundreds of thousands of pounds is the right choice when our economy is struggling the way it is, working people are struggling in the way they are, and our public services are on their knees. So it is the wrong choice. That is the wrong choice.
It's a tough juggling act the government faces. Soaring inflation and rising energy bills, stoked by the crisis in Ukraine, is proving challenging for millions around the country. After a summer of strikes by public sector workers, more strike action is expected in the next few months. Help is needed, is the message from unions. The government has now reacted, but how successful and expensive the measures will be over the long term remains to be seen. Kimberly Lim, CGTN.
Storm Fiona has brought chaos to eastern Canada with winds of up to 160 kilometres an hour. Large areas are without power, while some homes have been washed into the sea. One woman is currently missing, others were rescued from the water. Typhoon Noru has made landfall in the Philippines, with heavy rain and strong gales already forcing thousands to flee coastal areas. Dozens of flights have been cancelled and ferry services are also suspended. NASA has delayed the launch of its Artemis moon rockets for a third time because of an approaching tropical storm. The American Space Agency's most powerful rocket was set for liftoff on Tuesday, but that's now been cancelled, with Storm Ian expected to hit Florida. In the United States, a small town in New Mexico recently came very close to running out of water. A potential disaster was averted when temporary filtration systems were put in place. But the town learned a lesson and is now committed to diversifying and conserving its water. Our correspondent Ediz Tianshan reports.
It was a wake-up call for the residents of this small town in New Mexico when they were told they could run out of clean water in just a few weeks.
The way we cope with it is to try and conserve everything that we can in terms of the water. And a lot of us are recycling, dishwater, catching shower water, recycling, trying to conserve in every way that we can, and cutting down on how much water we use to begin with.
It's been a community effort that helped avert what could have been a much bigger disaster.
We asked the customers, the consumers, the businesses to cut back, and they did a tremendous job, and they saved more than 10%. We normally use about 1.3 to 1.5 million gallons a day, and we're down to about 1.1. So the community's done a great job on conserving.
A temporary infiltration system has saved the day for now, but the water insecurity hasn't gone away.
Residents of this small town in New Mexico have faced water shortages in the past, but many of them realize the situation had never become so dire, as they will be asked to conserve water for many years to come until a permanent solution could be found.
This summer, the largest wildfire in New Mexico's history resulted in massive debris that later contaminated some of its water supplies, including the main source for Las Vegas, reminding city officials about the unexpected consequences of climate change.
We're seeing that in our dryness of our forests. We're seeing less snowpack during our winter months, which in return relates to how much water we have in our monsoon season. But I think we need to continue those conversations for the future, because it doesn't look like anything's going to get better in that topic. So.
For the first time in its 40-year history, this international school in Montezuma even has a sustainability manager on campus who oversees student projects that aims at water conservation for a more sustainable future. They recently planted butterfly gardens with only native species that require little water.
We also started to collect all the dry wood and dead wood from our campus and pile it into hedgerows so that these become barriers for sediments to slow down water, to infiltrate water, and to rehydrate the soils. That will make us, in the end, more resilient against wildfire.
State officials are also working on future preparedness by drafting a 50-year water plan that will suggest ways in which communities could adapt to the new realities brought by climate change. It is Tianshan, CGTN, Las Vegas, New Mexico.
Vineyards in southern France have taken a brutal hit this year, a direct result of the scorching summer brought on by climate change. It's left winemakers facing a number of tough choices, including changing the types of grape they grow in order to adapt. Our correspondent Sarah Coates has the story.
Inspecting his vineyard in the prestige wine region of Bordeaux in the south of France, Julien Zouanet has made the tough call to harvest his grapes 2 weeks ahead of schedule as high temperatures in the south persist long after it traditionally cools off.
We adapt all the time. That's what farmers do, not just to climate change, to fungus, high temperatures, drought, frost, but we won't change our product.
Farmers right across the region are facing a time-sensitive challenge of sustaining these world-famous vineyards in the face of climate change as the roots on plants struggle to find water while the pounding sun scorches its fruit.
En agriculture biologique, notre ennemi, c'est le champignon.
In bioagriculture, our biggest enemy is fungus, especially when humidity is high. So usually we cut the leaves around the grapes to let them breathe. But when it's dry, like this year, we keep the leaves on to protect the grapes from the sun.
Further south, in Fitou, which is near the border with Spain, Jean-Marie Fabre, who is the president of France's Independent Winemakers Association, agrees that growers need to make urgent changes to remain viable. Like many others in the region, he's already seeing substantial drops in grape yields, down 10% this year and 25% last year, and says the future of prestige wines from this area remains unknown.
Aujourd'hui, je ne suis pas capable de savoir si...
I'm not sure whether this variety can survive 5, 10 or 15 years longer under these conditions and with our current practices. What I do know is that by adapting our cultivation processes and improving how we use water, this vineyard can continue to produce quality grapes even if temperatures rise further.
With the hot summer causing a drop in the amount of grapes harvested, the quality has actually been very good. But wine growers are telling us if these summers continue to just get hotter and hotter, not only will the yield drop, but also the quality.
If the plant suffers, it will feed the grapes less, leading to lower quality, less tasty grapes. We can counter this by controlling how we plant grass, which can retain water, and by using different types of soil and creating more shade on the grapes at certain times of the year, so they can give water back to the plant when it needs it.
So, with many challenges being faced, could one solution to France's wine woes lie abroad, in grape varieties that are able to resist extreme conditions?
La vigne existe toujours aujourd'hui en Israël, au Maroc, en Algérie.
There are vines in Israel, Morocco, Algeria and Greece growing in climates that are hotter and drier than France. We must research these to see how they can be planted in the south of France today.
It seems certain that changes will have to be made to give this rich element of French culture a fighting chance in our ever-changing world. Sarah Coates for CGTN in the south of France.
Now, it's Chinese Language Week in New Zealand, with school students taking part in competitions and performances all across the country. As Owen Poland reports, for many of them, it's all about getting a laugh.
A traditional lion dance signalled the start of New Zealand's Chinese Language Week, before high school students from several major cities demonstrated their skill speaking Mandarin. For many winners of the regional speech competitions, like Anna Riley, it's also an opportunity to show a wider understanding of Chinese culture.
It's always been something very new and very interesting to me, just because it's so different to what it is, what Western culture's like. So, yeah, I was just really interested in broadening my knowledge of the world.
New Zealand's Chinese Language Week is now in its 8th year, and there's growing support for an event that bridges the cultural gap.
Well, I think sharing a language just enables people to be ultimately more tolerant and inclusive, just leads to greater understanding.
Chinese crosstalk injects some humour into the conversation and has added benefits for school friends like William and Joshua.
We're able to practice our Chinese speaking abilities in more ways than one, because we have to engage with an audience, make sure that they laugh, which is pretty hard to do in a language that we're not completely familiar with, right?
Amongst the audience was China's ambassador to New Zealand, who was suitably impressed by the various performances.
I was so amazed by the level of proficiency achieved by some of the boys and girls.
And for many students, it's an opportunity to build the foundation for a future career.
I definitely want to work overseas as a businessman, so Chinese will be a very useful skill to have, especially with talking to more people.
And as New Zealand celebrates 50 years of diplomatic relations with China in 2022, the ambassador says Chinese Language Week lays a foundation for the next 50 years.
With the knowledge about the language and the culture, with the friends they make, I think they will make wonderful ambassadors of the people between the two countries.
Owen Poland, CGTN, Auckland.
And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. There'll be more news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's Razor. For now, from all of the team here in London, goodbye.